A dog brought her dying puppy to the veterinary clinic. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. At first, it seems like a heartbreaking moment, a mother risking everything for her baby. But what the clinic staff discovers isn't just a medical emergency. It's the beginning of something much bigger. As they race to save the pup, a buried secret slowly starts to unravel. One that links this loyal dog to a tragedy no one saw coming, and a truth someone wanted to keep hidden. Why did this dog choose this clinic? And what exactly is it that they're not supposed to find? What happens when saving a life reveals a buried one? Your presence here is powerful. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet gestures of compassion that truly stand out. If your heart still makes room for kindness, you're already one of us. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the farmhouse windows as Georgia Talbot moved through her morning routine. Her tired green eyes caught her reflection in the kitchen window. She looked worn, like a photograph that had faded at the edges. The old farmhouse creaked and settled around her, its familiar sounds a constant reminder of her mother-in-law's absence, and more painfully, of Warren's. Baron, the aging German shepherd, padded after her with the quiet devotion he'd shown since Warren's death 6 months ago. His graying muzzle and slower gait matched Georgia's own weariness, but his amber eyes remained alert, especially when watching baby Colt. "I know, boy," Georgia murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "I miss him too." Colt babbled happily from his playmat in the living room, surrounded by soft toys and the watchful presence of Baron. At 8 months old, he was the spitting image of Warren, the same bright blue eyes and dimpled smile that made Georgia's heart ache with both joy and grief. The morning had started like any other, but Georgia felt overwhelmed. The constant rain, the isolation of the rural Pennsylvania farmhouse, and the weight of single parenthood pressed down on her shoulders. The questions about Warren's death, officially ruled an accident during a routine fire call, circled in her mind like restless birds. Something wasn't right, she whispered to herself, a habit she'd developed in the quiet moments. The investigation had been quick. Too quick, she thought, and the explanations hadn't matched the Warren she knew, the careful, experienced firefighter who never took unnecessary risks. Colt's hungry cry pulled her from her thoughts. "Coming, sweetie," she called, heading to the pantry for his morning snack. The old wooden door creaked as she stepped inside, the musty smell of preserved foods and aged wood filling her nostrils. Georgia reached for the baby crackers on the top shelf, having to stretch and shuffle some items around. A jar of preserved peaches, one of her mother-in-law's last batches, tipped precariously. She caught it just in time, but in doing so, knocked over a container of rice. The plastic container burst open on the floor, tiny grains scattering everywhere. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, bending down to start cleaning up the mess. The task took longer than expected as she tried to gather the rice from every corner and crack in the old wooden floor. Suddenly, Baron's deep bark cut through the sound of rain and her own frustrated sighs. It wasn't his usual alert bark. This was different, urgent, and aggressive. Georgia's heart leaped into her throat. "Colt!" she called out, abandoning the rice and rushing from the pantry. "Mommy's coming!" The scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. The living room was in chaos, Colt's toys scattered, his playmat askew. The front door stood open, rain and wind whipping the curtains, and Colt was gone. "Colt!" Georgia screamed, panic clawing at her chest. "Colt!" Baron stood at the open door, his aging body tense and alert, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Without hesitation, he bounded out into the rain, moving with a speed that belied his years. Georgia ran after him, her sock-covered feet slipping on the wet porch boards. The rain soaked through her clothes instantly as she scanned the yard, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Through the curtain of rain, she caught a glimpse of movement near the old barn. A dark figure running, something clutched in their arms. Her baby. Someone was taking her baby. Baron was already charging across the yard, his powerful frame focused on the fleeing figure. Georgia ran after them, her feet squelching in the mud, her lungs burning as she screamed her son's name over and over. The world narrowed to this singular moment. The rain, the mud, the sound of her own desperate breaths, and the sight of Barron closing the distance to the mysterious figure. Her mind couldn't process what was happening, couldn't understand who would take her child or why. But her body moved with the pure instinct of a mother protecting her baby. Time seemed to slow as Barron reached the figure, launching himself with a ferocity that surprised even Georgia. She heard a shout, saw Colt falling from the person's arms, and watched in horror as Barron and the attacker tumbled to the ground. Georgia's feet carried her forward automatically, her only thought reaching her son. Colt lay crying in the mud, thankfully appearing unharmed. She scooped him up, clutching him to her chest as Barron's snarls and the sound of a struggle continued behind her. When she turned, the attacker was already fleeing toward the tree line, leaving Barron standing guard, his fur matted with mud and rain. The loyal dog's sides heaved with exertion, but his posture remained protective, his eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had disappeared into the woods. Georgia stood frozen in the rain, holding Colt tightly as he cried against her shoulder. Her mind reeled with questions, but one thing was devastatingly clear. This was no random attempt. Someone had targeted her home, had known she was alone, had waited for the right moment, and suddenly, the doubts she'd had about Warren's death didn't feel like paranoia anymore. Georgia's legs trembled as she raced back into the house, clutching Colt tightly to her chest. Her wet clothes dripped onto the hardwood floor as she slammed and locked the door behind her. The living room still showed signs of the struggle. Toys scattered, furniture askew, a small muddy handprint on the wall that made her stomach turn. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," she whispered, though her voice shook. Colt whimpered against her shoulder, his tiny fingers gripping her shirt. She needed to call the police, but first, she had to make sure Barron was all right. "Barron," she called out, moving through the house. "Barron, where are you?" The silence that answered made her heart race faster. She hurried to check each room, leaving wet footprints in her wake. The kitchen was empty, the bathroom door still open, nothing in the spare room. But when she reached the back of the house, her blood ran cold. Muddy footprints led from the back door toward the woods, bigger than her own. Someone else was still here. Before panic could completely overtake her, a familiar bark echoed from the woods behind the house. Barron's bark, urgent, demanding. Georgia grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter and rushed to the back door. Her hands shook as she dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? Someone tried to take my baby, Georgia said, her voice cracking. My dog chased them into the woods. Please, I need help. I'm at 427 Old Mill Road. Ma'am, stay inside. Officers are on their way. Are you and your child safe? Another bark from Barron, more insistent this time. Yes, we're safe, but my dog... Georgia swallowed hard. He's out there. I can hear him barking. Ma'am, please stay inside until officers arrive. But Georgia couldn't wait. Barron's barking had changed. It wasn't aggressive anymore, but persistent, like when he used to alert during his search and rescue days. She had to know. Still holding Colt, she stepped onto the back porch. The rain had settled into a light drizzle, and she could see Barron's gray form about 50 yards into the woods, standing over something. No, someone. Barron, she called out. The old dog's tail wagged once, but he didn't move from his position. He was guarding something. Georgia's heart pounded as she approached. As she got closer, she could see a man lying face down in the wet leaves, Barron standing over him with quiet authority. The man wasn't moving. Oh my God, she whispered, taking a step back. That's when she noticed something glinting in the man's limp hand. A syringe. The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a random break-in. This person had come prepared, had come for Colt. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Georgia backed away from the unconscious man, murmuring soothing words to Colt, who had finally stopped crying and was now hiccuping softly against her shoulder. Barron maintained his position, only moving his eyes to track Georgia's movement. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled up to the house, lights flashing. Officers approached with weapons drawn, but Georgia quickly called out to them. "He's unconscious. My dog stopped him." The next hour passed in a blur. The man was handcuffed and taken into custody, still unconscious. An ambulance arrived to check on Colt, who was thankfully unharmed. Georgia answered questions as clearly as she could, her nursing training helping her maintain composure despite her shaking hands. "Can you think of anyone who might want to harm you or your son?" one officer asked, notepad ready. Georgia shook her head. "No, we just moved here after my husband." She stopped, swallowing hard. "After he died." As the officers documented the scene, Georgia noticed something that made her breath catch. The unconscious man was being loaded into a police car, and as his arm fell limp, she caught sight of an expensive watch on his wrist. Even from a distance, she could see something engraved on its face, initials, though she couldn't make them out. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. Something about this felt wrong. The watch was too expensive for a random criminal. The syringe suggested planning, and the timing. Barron pressed against her leg, bringing her back to the present. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, noticing a small cut above his eye from the struggle. "You're a hero, boy," she whispered. "You saved Colt." But as she watched the police cars pull away and hugged her son closer, Georgia couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The same instinct that had told her something was wrong about Warren's death was screaming at her now. This wasn't random. This was calculated. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrible suspicion began to form. Georgia sat in her kitchen, staring at the police report spread across the table. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows over the documents that detailed yesterday's terrifying events. Barron lay at her feet, his watchful eyes never leaving the back door. "James Mitchell," she read aloud, studying the intruder's mugshot. "Former paramedic, lost his license 3 years ago." The man's face was weathered, with dark circles under his eyes and a scar along his jawline. His record showed multiple arrests for selling prescription medications and performing unauthorized medical procedures. Detective Roberts, a heavyset man with graying temples, sat across from her. "He's not talking yet, but we found equipment in his car suggesting this was planned. Sedatives, zip ties, a burner phone." Georgia's hands trembled as she lifted her coffee mug. "But why? Why target us? I've never even heard of this man." "Sometimes these cases are random," Roberts said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Sexual predators, kidnappers, they often choose targets of opportunity." But Georgia's nursing instincts told her otherwise. The precision of the attempt, the medical supplies, the timing, it felt calculated. She thought about the expensive watch she'd glimpsed, remembering how out of place it had seemed. "What about the watch?" she asked. "Did you find any identifying marks?" Roberts shifted uncomfortably. "It was gone when we processed him. Must have fallen off in the woods." Before Georgia could press further, a knock at the door made her jump. Barron was instantly alert, moving between her and the entrance. Through the window, she saw a tall man in a weathered leather jacket standing on her porch. "Daniel," she whispered, recognizing her late husband's friend. Daniel Corr's presence brought a flood of memories. He and Warren had worked together at the fire department for years before Daniel left to become a private investigator. She hadn't seen him since the funeral. After checking through the peephole, Georgia opened the door. Daniel's face was more lined than she remembered, his dark hair flecked with gray at the temples. "Georgia," he said softly, "I heard what happened. Are you and Colt okay?" Detective Roberts appeared behind her. "Mr. Corr, this is an active investigation." "I'm aware," Daniel replied coolly. "I'm here as a friend of the family." Something in the way the two men looked at each other made Georgia's skin prickle. There was tension there, unspoken but palpable. Roberts gathered his papers. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Talbot. Remember what we discussed about keeping your doors locked." After the detective left, Daniel's demeanor changed. He glanced around the kitchen with practiced eyes, then spoke in a low voice. "Don't trust them, Georgia. The local police. They're compromised." "What?" Georgia felt her chest tighten. "What are you talking about?" Daniel pulled out his phone, showing her a photo. It was the same watch she'd seen on the intruder, but the image was clearer. The engraving read JM with a strange symbol beneath it. "This watch? It belongs to a shell company, one that's connected to some very powerful people in this county." He paused, his expression grave. "The same people Warren was investigating before he died." Georgia sank into a chair, her legs weak. "Warren's death? It wasn't an accident." "He contacted me 2 days before it happened," Daniel said, sitting across from her. "Said he'd found something big. Something about missing medical supplies, unauthorized procedures. He was going to show me his evidence. But then—" Georgia's mind raced. She remembered Warren's strange behavior in those final days. The late-night phone calls, the locked drawer in his desk, how distracted he'd seemed. "His files," she whispered. "They're still in his office upstairs." Together, they went to Warren's study. The room was exactly as he'd left it, dust gathering on the old desk. Georgia pulled out the key she'd never used, her hands shaking as she opened the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath stacks of routine paperwork, they found a manila envelope. Georgia spread its contents across the desk. Handwritten notes, photographs, spreadsheets with highlighted sections. "Look at this," Daniel said, pointing to a page of Warren's neat handwriting. Names, dates, locations. He was tracking something. Georgia picked up a note that made her blood run cold. In Warren's familiar scrawl, "Medical supplies diverted. Children involved. Must stop them." "Daniel," she said, her voice barely audible. "The man who tried to take Colt, he was a paramedic with access to medical supplies." "Now you understand why I'm here," Daniel replied grimly. "This wasn't random, Georgia. They're cleaning up loose ends, and somehow they think Colt is connected to whatever Warren discovered." Georgia looked down at her husband's notes, feeling the weight of this new reality settling over her. Warren hadn't died in a tragic accident. He'd been silenced. And now someone was after her son. The truth she'd sensed but couldn't name was finally taking shape, and it was more terrifying than anything she'd imagined. Georgia stared at the scattered papers across Warren's desk, her heart pounding. The manila envelope had revealed more questions than answers. But one thing was becoming clear. Her husband's death hadn't been the accident everyone claimed. "These numbers," Daniel said, pointing to a series of dates and figures in Warren's meticulous handwriting. "They're emergency dispatch codes, but they don't match standard protocol." Georgia leaned closer, recognizing some of the medical terminology from her nursing work. "Look at these supply requisitions. The quantities don't make sense for routine emergency responses." Daniel nodded grimly. Warren noticed the same thing. He started tracking discrepancies in the county's emergency medical services records, missing supplies, unusual dispatch patterns, procedures that didn't add up. "But why would the EMS board be involved?" Georgia asked, shuffling through more papers. "Follow the money," Daniel replied, pulling out his laptop. "The board controls millions in funding, equipment purchases, staffing decisions. Perfect cover for something bigger." As they dug deeper into Warren's files, the pieces started falling into place. There were photographs of unmarked vehicles at odd hours, lists of names with question marks beside them, and carefully documented timeline anomalies in emergency response records. "Here," Georgia said suddenly, her finger tracing a line in Warren's notes. 3 weeks before he died, he wrote about unauthorized procedures and our directed resources. The same things you mentioned earlier." Barron's sudden growl interrupted them. The German shepherd stood at attention, staring out the study window. Georgia moved to look, catching a glimpse of a dark sedan parked at the end of her long driveway. "How long has that been happening?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with concern. "I've noticed cars sitting there the past few days," Georgia admitted. I thought I was being paranoid." "You're not," Daniel said. "They're watching the house." As if on cue, Georgia's phone rang. The screen showed an unknown number. When she answered, there was only silence on the other end, followed by a click. "Third call like that today," she said, her hands shaking slightly as she set down the phone. Daniel's expression darkened. "They're sending a message. They know you're looking into this." Georgia sank into Warren's old chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "The man who tried to take Colt? You said he was connected to all this?" "James Merrick," Daniel confirmed, pulling up an image on his laptop. "Former paramedic, lost his license 3 years ago for stealing medical supplies. But look at his recent bank records." Georgia's eyes widened at the regular deposits from a company she didn't recognize. "Someone's paying him." "Same shell company that bought him that expensive watch," Daniel said. "And guess who sits on the board? 2 county EMS officials." Barron growled again, more intensely this time. Through the window, they watched the sedan slowly pull away, only to be replaced by a different vehicle 10 minutes later. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," Daniel muttered. Georgia felt a chill run down her spine. She thought about the intruder, about the syringe he'd been carrying. What would they want with Colt? Daniel hesitated before answering. "Warren's last message to me mentioned children, something about unauthorized medical procedures. I think he discovered they were using the EMS system to experiment." "Oh God," Georgia whispered, her maternal instincts flaring. She rushed to check on Colt, finding him still sleeping peacefully in his crib. Barron followed, taking up his usual protective position nearby. Back in the study, Georgia's hands were steady as she gathered Warren's files. "We need to decode the rest of these documents." Warren was careful. He would have left evidence somewhere. "Already on it," Daniel said, showing her a pattern in Warren's notes. He used a simple substitution cipher for the sensitive information. Classic firefighter trick. That where we used to do it with incident reports when we suspected internal affairs was compromised. As they worked through the encoded sections, Georgia's phone rang again. Another silent call. But this time, she was ready. "You can watch all you want," she said firmly into the phone. "I'm not stopping until I find out what happened to my husband." After she hung up, Daniel looked at her with newfound respect. "You know this makes you a target, too." Georgia nodded, thinking of Warren, of Colt, of everything at stake. "They already tried to take my son. They killed my husband. I'm done being afraid." Through the window, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the farmhouse grounds. The watching vehicle remained in place, its presence both a threat and a confirmation. Whatever Warren had discovered, it was big enough to kill for, big enough to orphan a child over, big enough to mobilize powerful people against a young widow and her infant son. But they had underestimated her. They had underestimated the fierce protective instinct of a mother, the loyalty of a friend like Daniel, and the dedication of a guard dog like Barron. Most of all, they had underestimated Warren's foresight in documenting everything. Georgia looked at the files spread across the desk, her husband's final. Georgia and Daniel sat surrounded by Warren's decoded notes, piecing together a pattern that made her stomach turn. The names and dates formed a web of corruption far bigger than she'd imagined. "Look at these procurement records," Daniel said, spreading out several papers. "Every major medical equipment contract went through one company, Meridian Healthcare Solutions." Georgia leaned forward, scanning the documents. "And who owns Meridian?" "On paper, it's a subsidiary of larger corporations, but follow the money." Daniel pulled up his laptop, showing her a complex diagram. "It all leads back to Eugene Wexler." "The county commissioner?" Georgia's eyes widened. She knew the name. Everyone did. Wexler's face was plastered across local billboards, always smiling, always promising progress for their community. 3 terms in office, Daniel confirmed. Clean public image, chairs multiple charity boards. But look at this. He pointed to Warren's notes. These dates match perfectly with unusual deaths among first responders, all ruled accidents or natural causes. Georgia's hands trembled as she read the list. Mark Stevens, cardiac arrest at 42. Sarah Chen, car accident. James Foster, apparent suicide. She looked up. They all worked EMS or fire service, and every single one had raised questions about medical supply sourcing or unusual procedure protocols. Daniel's voice was grim. Warren wasn't the first to notice something wrong. He was just the latest to pay for it. Georgia stood abruptly. I need to check something at his old station. It's not safe. Nothing's safe anymore, she interrupted. But I remember Warren talking to Pete Martinez about his concerns. Pete might know more. At the fire station, Georgia found only confused looks and awkward silences. Finally, a young firefighter pulled her aside. Pete's been gone 3 weeks, he whispered. Called in sick one day, never came back. Chief says he transferred, but... He glanced around nervously. His apartment's empty, like he just vanished. Georgia felt cold despite the station's warmth. In Warren's locker, now emptied except for a few personal items, she found a single notepad tucked behind a loose panel. The last page held a hastily scrawled message. EW knows. Watch M shipments. Back at the farmhouse, she shared her discovery with Daniel. EW, Eugene Wexler. Warren knew who was behind it. And paid with his life, Daniel said softly. The question is, what are these M shipments? Before Georgia could respond, Barron's ears perked up. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he moved toward the back door. Georgia heard it too. Footsteps on the porch. Get Colt, Daniel whispered, drawing a concealed weapon. Back room now. Georgia scooped up her sleeping son just as glass shattered somewhere downstairs. Barron's barking exploded through the house, followed by the sound of running feet and cursing. When they emerged minutes later, the intruder was gone, but they'd left their mark. Carved deep into the barn door were the same initials Georgia had seen on the watch of Colt's would-be abductor. MHS. Meridian Healthcare Solutions, Daniel translated, running his fingers over the marks. They're not even trying to hide anymore. Georgia held Colt closer, her heart racing, but her voice steady. Because they think they're untouchable. Wexler has everyone in his pocket. Police, county officials, maybe even state authorities. Not everyone, Daniel countered. We have Warren's evidence. We just need to figure out what these shipments are and find proof that connects them directly to Wexler. Georgia stared at the carved initials, thinking of Warren's last message. Watch M shipments. Her husband had died trying to expose whatever Wexler was hiding. Now Pete was missing too, and someone had tried to take her son. Barron stood guard by the barn door, his aging frame still imposing in the moonlight. His loyalty was a reminder of everything she was fighting for. Justice for Warren, safety for Colt, and the truth about the corrupt system that had taken so much from so many families. We need to move carefully, Daniel warned. Wexler didn't get where he is by being careless. He's got resources, connections, and apparently no problem eliminating threats. Georgia nodded, her determination hardening. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture darker than she'd imagined. But now they had a name, a face, and a starting point. Eugene Wexler might think himself untouchable, but he hadn't counted on a grieving nurse with nothing left to lose except the truth. Georgia's hands shook as she packed Colt's favorite stuffed giraffe into his overnight bag. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her heart, but she knew it was the right choice. Her sister Amy lived 3 hours away in a quiet Pittsburgh suburb, far enough from Wexler's influence to keep Colt safe. I'll guard him with my life, Amy promised, hugging Georgia tightly in her driveway. Just be careful, okay? This sounds dangerous. Georgia watched through tears as Amy's minivan disappeared around the corner, Colt's tiny hand waving from his car seat. Barron whined beside her, sensing her distress. It's temporary, she whispered, more to herself than the dog. Just until we can make this right. Back at the farmhouse, Daniel had transformed the kitchen table into a makeshift investigation center. Papers, financial records, and medical supply manifests covered every inch of surface. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a spreadsheet. "Meridian Healthcare Solutions has been making regular payments to a shell company called Vista Medical Holdings. The amounts are substantial, $50,000 every month like clockwork." Georgia leaned in, her nursing experience kicking in. "These supply orders don't make sense. The quantities are too high for a facility this size, and some of these medications—" She tapped the screen. "These are specific to organ preservation. No standard medical center would need this much." Daniel nodded grimly. "I tracked Vista Medical to an unmarked building outside of town. No licenses, no permits, but heavy security and regular deliveries. Perfect setup for black market operations." They worked through the night, connecting dots Warren had started to uncover. Georgia's medical knowledge helped identify suspicious patterns in emergency call records, accidents that seemed staged, deaths that happened too conveniently. "Warren must have noticed these discrepancies during his shifts," she said, rubbing her tired eyes. "Healthy people suddenly dying, organs harvested before proper protocols could be followed." "And Wexler's Charity Foundation handling all the paperwork," Daniel added. "Clean, efficient, and completely corrupt." Around midnight, Georgia remembered something that had been nagging at her memory. "Wait here," she said, hurrying upstairs to the attic. She returned with an old music box, a family heirloom from Warren's mother. "He was acting strange about this before he died. Kept checking it, wouldn't let me touch it." Daniel examined the wooden box carefully. "Look at these scratch marks around the base. Someone's opened this recently." Together, they discovered the false bottom. Hidden inside was a small digital recorder, dusty but intact. Georgia's hands trembled as she pressed play. Warren's voice filled the room, tired but determined. "If you're hearing this, something's happened to me. I've documented everything. The fake accidents, the illegal harvesting, the payoffs. Wexler's running an organ trafficking ring right under everyone's noses. He's using his position to coordinate with corrupt EMTs and doctors. They're targeting vulnerable people, staging accidents, falsifying death certificates." Georgia pressed a hand to her mouth, tears flowing freely as Warren's voice continued, laying out names, dates, and locations. He'd gathered enough evidence to destroy Wexler's entire operation. "This is why they killed him," she whispered. "He was about to expose everything." Daniel was already making calls. "I have a contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in Philadelphia. This is way beyond local jurisdiction. Wexler's got too many people in his pocket here. How soon can they meet?" "Tomorrow morning. My contact can arrange a secure location." Daniel paused, studying her face. "Georgia, you don't have to be there. I can handle the handoff." She shook her head firmly. "Warren died trying to stop this. I need to see it through." She touched the recorder gently. "Besides, I understand the medical aspects better than anyone. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will need my testimony to make sense of it all." They spent the next hour making copies of the recording and all their supporting documentation. Georgia called Amy for an update on Colt. He was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm about to break. "Tomorrow morning," Daniel said as he prepared to leave, "we meet my contact at 9 o'clock. No phones, no electronics except the evidence. I'll pick you up at 8. Georgia nodded, suddenly exhausted but determined. Barron followed her upstairs, taking his usual position guarding her bedroom door. In the quiet darkness, she thought of Warren, of his courage and integrity. He'd died trying to protect people, trying to expose a terrible truth. "We're going to finish what you started," she whispered into the night. "I promise." She clutched Warren's wedding ring, which she wore on a chain around her neck, and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would change everything. Justice for Warren, safety for Colt, and the end of Wexler's reign of corruption. The evidence was secure, and soon it would be in Federal Bureau of Investigation hands. The early morning fog clung to the winding back roads as Daniel's truck made its way toward Philadelphia. Georgia clutched the evidence folder, her knuckles white. Barron sat alert in the back seat, his ears perked forward. "We're taking County Route 7, Daniel explained. "Less traffic, harder to—" He slammed on the brakes as two black SUVs suddenly blocked the road ahead. "Reverse!" Georgia shouted, but the screech of tires behind them confirmed they were trapped. Her heart hammered as dark figures emerged from the vehicles, weapons drawn. "Get down!" Daniel yanked Georgia below the dashboard as bullets shattered the windows. Barron launched himself through the broken rear window with a fierce growl, attacking the nearest gunman. The man screamed as the German shepherd's powerful jaws clamped onto his arm. Daniel pulled his own weapon and returned fire, creating cover. "Run for the trees! I'll hold them off!" Georgia clutched the evidence folder to her chest and bolted from the truck. A bullet whizzed past her head as she sprinted toward the forest edge. Behind her, Barron's snarls mixed with shouts and gunfire. She heard Daniel cry out in pain, followed by Barron's yelp. Turning, she saw Daniel stumbling, clutching his shoulder. Barron lay motionless on the pavement. "Barron!" The cry tore from her throat. The loyal dog had saved them countless times. And now— "Georgia, go!" Daniel's voice cracked with pain and urgency. But she couldn't leave them. Georgia darted back, ducking behind the truck. Daniel had managed to take down 2 attackers, but more were advancing. She grabbed his good arm and helped him up. Barron stirred, struggling to his feet despite a bloody wound in his side. The sight gave Georgia strength. "Come on, boy! This way!" They half ran, half stumbled into the dense forest. Barron limped behind them, occasionally turning to growl at their pursuers. The sound of crashing footsteps and angry voices followed. "Warren's cabin," Daniel gasped between labored breaths. 2 miles north. They won't know about it." Georgia's legs burned as they pushed through the underbrush. Daniel's weight grew heavier against her shoulder, his blood seeping into her jacket. Barron's panting became more labored, but the loyal dog kept pace. After what felt like hours, a small wooden structure appeared through the trees. The cabin was well hidden, its weathered boards blending with the surrounding forest. Georgia helped Daniel inside, while Barron collapsed just past the threshold. "First aid kit," Daniel pointed to a cabinet. "Warren always kept supplies here." Georgia's nursing training took over as she treated Daniel's shoulder wound. The bullet had gone clean through, missing any major arteries. Once he was stabilized, she turned her attention to Barron. The dog's breathing was shallow, his fur matted with blood. "Oh, Barron," she whispered, cleaning his wound with trembling hands. "You brave, beautiful boy." His tail thumped weakly against the floor as she worked, his loyal eyes never leaving her face. When both patients were bandaged and resting, Georgia sank onto a dusty chair. The evidence folder was crumpled but intact. Outside, distant shouts indicated their pursuers were still searching. "They were waiting for us," Daniel said quietly. "Wexler must have informants in the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Georgia pressed her hands to her face. Everything they'd uncovered, everything Warren died for, it might not be enough. Wexler's influence reached too far, his corruption too deeply rooted. She thought of Colt, safely hidden with her sister. But for how long? Wexler's men had already tried to take him once. The commissioner's power seemed unlimited, his reach endless. Barron whimpered softly, trying to comfort her despite his pain. Georgia stroked his graying muzzle, remembering all the times he'd protected them. First Colt, now this. The loyal dog had given everything to keep them safe. "We can't trust anyone," she said finally. "The police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Wexler has people everywhere." Daniel shifted painfully. "Not everywhere. There are still good people fighting back. Warren knew that. That's why he kept gathering evidence, even when he knew the risks." Georgia looked at the folder in her lap. Her husband had died trying to expose this evil. Barron might die too. Daniel was wounded. The cost of fighting back was terrifyingly high. But giving up wasn't an option. Not with Colt's future at stake. Not with Warren's killers still in power. Not with Barron's sacrifice demanding justice. Through the cabin's grimy window, she watched the sun sink behind the trees. They were trapped here for now, wounded and hunted. But they weren't defeated. Not yet. Georgia sat in the dim cabin, Warren's digital recorder clutched in her trembling hands. Daniel dozed fitfully on the threadbare couch, his wounded shoulder freshly bandaged. Barron lay near the door, his breathing shallow but steady. The loyal dog's eyes followed her every movement. "I need to hear it again," she whispered, pressing play. Warren's voice filled the small space, familiar and heartbreaking. "If you're hearing this, something's happened to me." His words were measured, careful. The organ trafficking ring goes deeper than anyone suspects. Wexler's using emergency services to identify vulnerable targets. They're staging accidents, falsifying death certificates. Georgia closed her eyes, letting the pain of his voice wash over her. Then she heard something new, a detail she'd missed in their panic to escape earlier. "I've prepared for the worst," Warren continued. "Barron's collar. There's a tracking device inside. The activation code is our anniversary. If anything happens, use it. The signal's encrypted, untraceable. And Georgia, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I love you and Colt more than anything." The recording ended. Georgia's hand shook as she crossed to Barron, gently examining his collar. There, a tiny panel, nearly invisible against the leather. She input the date, 0515. A small light blinked green. "Daniel," she called softly. He stirred, grimacing. "Your secure network. Can we still access it?" He nodded, reaching for his battered laptop with his good arm. Signals bounced through multiple servers, impossible to trace. Georgia connected the recorder, uploading Warren's testimony. She added their collected evidence, financial records, falsified medical documents, everything they'd gathered. "It's not enough just to send this to the authorities," she said. "Wexler has too many people in his pocket." "We need to go public," Daniel agreed. "But first we need proof he's behind Warren's death. Without that direct link, he'll slip away." Georgia turned to the laptop, fingers flying across the keys. Years of hospital database work had taught her how to dig deep. She cross-referenced property records, shell companies, utility bills. "Here," she said finally. "A cabin in the mountains, owned by a corporation that traces back to Wexler's wife's family. Power usage spiked last week, the same night his inner circle had their monthly meeting." "That's where they plan everything." Daniel tried to sit up, but fell back with a groan. "We should wait until I can—" "No." George's voice was firm. "You can barely move. Barron's fighting for his life. We're out of time." She walked to Warren's gun safe, hidden behind a loose board. The combination, Colt's birthday, opened it easily. Inside lay her husband's off-duty weapon, a 9mm pistol he'd taught her to use during their first year of marriage. "Georgia, this is suicide," Daniel protested. "Wexler will have guards." "He'll also be overconfident," she replied, checking the magazine with steady hands. "He thinks we're running scared. He won't expect me to come to him." She knelt beside Barron, stroking his graying muzzle. "Stay with Daniel, boy. Keep him safe for me." The dog whimpered, trying to rise despite his wounds. "No, Barron. Rest now. You've done enough." Georgia packed light. The gun, a flashlight, her phone with the uploaded evidence ready to broadcast. She shrugged into Warren's old leather jacket, taking comfort in its familiar smell. "If I'm not back by dawn," she told Daniel, "release everything. Every piece of evidence, every connection we've found. Make it impossible to cover up. Georgia ... Daniel's face was drawn with worry. "Warren wouldn't want you to sacrifice yourself." She touched the wedding ring she still wore. "Warren sacrificed everything to protect people from Wexler's crimes. He died trying to expose the truth." Her green eyes hardened with determination. "I'm going to finish what he started." The setting sun painted the cabin in shades of amber as Georgia checked her gear one final time. Barron watched her with sad, knowing eyes. She remembered how he'd saved Colt, how he'd thrown himself at armed men to protect them. Now it was her turn to be the protector. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly. Wexler thought he could frighten me into silence, but he didn't count on one thing. She touched Warren's badge, still pinned to the jacket. "I'm a firefighter's wife. We don't back down when people need help." Georgia stepped out into the gathering dusk, the weight of Warren's gun solid against her hip. Behind her, Barron's soft whine mixed with Daniel's labored breathing. Ahead lay Wexler's mountain hideout, and the chance to finally bring Warren's killers to justice. The time for hiding was over. She had evidence uploading to secure servers, a tracker broadcasting their location to trusted authorities, and the element of surprise. Most importantly, she had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Thunder rolled across the mountains as Georgia crouched in the wet underbrush, studying Wexler's cabin through sheets of rain. Lightning illuminated the structure in stark flashes, a sprawling two-story lodge with a wraparound porch. One guard paced near the front door, collar turned up against the storm. She touched the syringe in her pocket, filled with the same sedative she'd used countless times in the emergency room. The irony wasn't lost on her, using medical knowledge to infiltrate rather than heal. But Wexler had corrupted everything he touched. Sometimes healing meant removing the disease. Georgia circled through the trees, timing her movements with the thunder. The guard never saw her coming. She emerged from the shadows behind him, needle finding its mark in his neck before he could shout. He slumped silently, and she dragged him under the porch. Inside, voices drifted from upstairs. Georgia moved carefully through the first floor, gun ready. Warren's weapon felt heavy but familiar, like his presence guiding her hands. Pictures lined the walls. Wexler shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at ceremonies. A respected pillar of the community who'd built his empire on stolen lives. A floorboard creaked overhead. Georgia pressed herself against the wall as footsteps descended the stairs. Two men entered the kitchen, talking in low voices about shipping schedules and organ preservation times. Her stomach turned at their casual discussion of their grotesque trade. Lightning flashed again, and through the window, Georgia caught movement. Dark SUVs approaching with lights off. The tracker had worked. Help was coming. She just had to keep Wexler contained. A door opened upstairs. "Something's wrong," Wexler's voice carried down. "Matthews isn't answering his radio." Georgia acted. She burst into the kitchen, gun raised. "Hands where I can see them." The two men froze, then slowly raised their arms. Face down on the floor. "Now!" They complied, but footsteps pounded above. Wexler running. Georgia zip-tied the men's hands with supplies from her pocket and sprinted upstairs. A door slammed at the end of the hall. "It's over, Wexler," she called out, advancing carefully. "Federal agents are already outside. This ends tonight." "You're in over your head, Mrs. Talbot." His voice came through the door. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Georgia replied. "A coward who kills innocent people for profit, who murdered my husband because he discovered the truth." The door burst open. Wexler charged out, a gun in his hand. Georgia fired first, catching him in the thigh. He crashed to the floor, weapon skittering away. She kicked it aside, keeping her gun trained on his head. "You killed Warren," she said, voice shaking with fury. "You had him murdered because he was going to expose your organ trafficking ring." Wexler clutched his bleeding leg, his polished facade cracking. "You can't prove anything." "The evidence is already uploaded. Warren's recording, financial records, everything. It's over." Below, doors crashed open as federal agents stormed in. Wexler lunged desperately, trying to reach his fallen gun. Georgia stepped forward and brought the butt of her weapon down on his temple, dropping him unconscious. Agents flooded upstairs, weapons drawn. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Everyone freeze." Georgia set her gun down slowly, raising her hands. "Georgia Talbot," she identified herself. "I'm the one who activated the tracker." The next hours passed in a blur of statements and evidence collection. Georgia learned that Barron had been rushed to an emergency veterinary hospital, critical but alive. Colt was safe at her sister's house, unaware of how close his mother had come to death. As dawn broke, Georgia stood on the porch watching Wexler being loaded into a federal vehicle. The silver-haired commissioner had lost his commanding presence, reduced to a handcuffed figure in the back of a car. An agent approached her with Warren's badge, recovered from Wexler's office. "Your husband was a hero, Mrs. Talbot. His investigation laid the groundwork for bringing down this entire operation." Georgia clutched the badge, feeling its familiar weight. "He died protecting people," she said softly. "I couldn't let that be for nothing." Thunder rumbled one final time as the storm moved on. Georgia thought of Barron fighting for his life, of Colt sleeping safely in his aunt's arms, of Warren's voice on that last recording. The truth was finally out. Justice would be served. She looked up at the clearing sky, feeling the first rays of sunrise on her face. The long night was over. It was time to go home. 3 weeks after the raid, Georgia sat in the crowded courthouse, watching Eugene Wexler stand before the judge. His expensive suit couldn't hide his defeated posture. The silver-haired commissioner who once commanded respect now looked small and pale. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole," the judge announced, her voice firm. "Additionally, the court orders full restitution to the victims' families." Georgia closed her eyes, letting out a long breath. Around her, families of other victims, firefighters, paramedics, and innocent people caught in Wexler's web, shared quiet tears and embraces. Daniel Corr, still walking with a cane from his injuries, squeezed her shoulder. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Wexler's operation. 7 county officials were indicted for their roles in the organ trafficking ring. Emergency calls had been redirected, accident victims harvested, and records falsified. Warren had discovered it all, piece by piece, until it cost him his life. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around the steps. Georgia held Colt close as cameras flashed. The baby, now nearly walking, buried his face in her neck. "Mrs. Talbot," a reporter called out, "how do you feel about Commissioner Wexler's sentencing?" "Yeah?" Georgia paused, choosing her words carefully. "Today isn't about Wexler. It's about justice for every family he hurt. It's about my husband, Warren Talbot, who gave his life trying to expose the truth." At home, Barron greeted them with a gentler version of his old enthusiasm. The veterinarians had worked miracles, but his injuries had forced retirement from his protective duties. His muzzle was completely gray now, and he moved more slowly, but his amber eyes remained alert and loving. "Good boy," Georgia whispered, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. He leaned against her, tail wagging. The German shepherd who had saved both her and Colt would never chase down threats again, but he'd earned his rest. That evening, the local fire station held a ceremony. Warren's old colleagues had arranged for a permanent memorial plaque, recognizing his sacrifice and service. The fire chief presented Georgia with a folded flag and Warren's badge, now restored to honor. Warren Talbot exemplified the highest ideals of public service, the chief declared to the gathered crowd. He saw wrong being done and refused to look away. His courage ultimately brought down a criminal enterprise that had claimed too many lives. Georgia stood with Colt in her arms, tears falling freely. Her son reached for the shiny badge, too young to understand, but somehow sensing its importance. Around them, firefighters and their families offered support, not just colleagues anymore, but an extended family watching over Warren's wife and child. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Georgia dressed Colt in his warmest clothes and loaded him into the car. Barron carefully climbed into the back seat, settling next to the baby's car seat. They drove to the cemetery where Warren rested. The headstone was simple granite, recently updated with a small plaque noting his service and sacrifice. Georgia set down fresh flowers and helped Colt place a toy fire truck, one of Warren's last gifts to his son. "Your daddy was a hero," she told Colt softly. "He stood up for what was right, just like Barron did for us. And now everyone knows the truth." Barron lay down beside the grave, as he often did during their visits. His loyalty extended beyond death, a guardian even here. Georgia sat on the grass, settling Colt in her lap. "We're safe now, Warren," she said. "The people who hurt you can't hurt anyone else. Colt will grow up knowing what you did, how brave you were." She touched the headstone. "I miss you every day, but I'm stronger now. I'll make sure our son knows your story." Colt babbled and reached for the flowers. Barron's tail thumped against the grass. A warm breeze rustled the trees, carrying away the last weight of fear and uncertainty Georgia had carried for so long. Later that day, she returned to work at the hospital. Her colleagues welcomed her back with hugs and support. The experience had changed her approach to nursing. She was more alert to signs of trouble, more determined to protect vulnerable patients. Warren's spirit of vigilance lived on through her work. At home that evening, Georgia watched Colt playing on the floor while Barron dozed nearby. The farmhouse felt peaceful now, filled with memories but no longer haunted by unanswered questions. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, carrying Warren's badge of honor and his dedication to protecting others. Justice had been served. Their family was safe, and though Warren was gone, his legacy lived on in the truth finally brought to light, in the son who would know his father's courage, and in the wife who had finished what he started. Barron lifted his head and gave a contented sigh. Georgia smiled, reaching down to pat him. Together, they had all found their way home. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.